Hey everyone, I'm Rachel, 33 years old, and if you'd asked me 2 years ago where I'd be right now, I'd have painted you a pretty picture. Happily married to Mark, sipping coffee on the porch of our cute little craftsman house in the suburbs of Austin, maybe even planning our first kid. Instead, here I am, alone in a dingy studio apartment downtown, the kind with peeling paint and a faucet that drips all night, scrolling through Mark's Instagram while a half-empty bottle of $7 Pinot Noir sits on the counter, judging me. My life used to look like something out of a lifestyle blog: perfect husband, perfect home, perfect everything. But I trashed it all, not because Mark wasn't enough, but because I wanted something he couldn't be: wild, unpredictable, rough around the edges. He was my safe harbor, my soft place to land, but I craved a hurricane, and I chased it until I drowned. Let's rewind to where it all began. I met Mark 5 years ago at a friend's wedding in Dallas. I was 28, working as a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm, still picking up the pieces from a string of trainwreck boyfriends who'd left me broke, crying, or screaming at 3 a.m. Mark was 30, a high school history teacher with this calm, gentle energy, medium height, dark brown hair that always fell a little messy over his forehead wire-rimmed glasses that gave him this nerdy cute vibe. He wasn't the guy who'd swagger into a room and demand attention. He was the one who'd stand by the snack table, sipping a Coke, ready to catch your glass if you dropped it. At the reception, the DJ spun some slow Ed Sheeran track. Perfect, I think, and Mark walked over, hands in his pockets, and asked, "Wanna dance?" I'd had a couple glasses of champagne, so I said sure, stumbling a little in my heels. When I tripped, he caught me, steadying me with this warm, lopsided smile, and said, "Guess I'm your safety net tonight." It was corny as hell, but it hit me right in the chest. After years of chaos, guys who'd ghost me, cheat on me, or drain my bank account, Mark felt like a deep breath. We started dating, and it was like nothing I'd ever known. My exes were all storms. Dylan, the worst of them, was this tattooed musician who'd drag me to dive bars and blow his rent money on guitar pedals. Mark was a breeze, steady, predictable kind. Our first date was at this tiny diner off I-35, vinyl booths and greasy hash browns, and he insisted on paying, blushing when I teased him about it. "I like taking care of you," he said, and I laughed, thinking, okay, this is new. He picked me up after work in his old Honda Civic, the one with a dented fender he never got fixed, and take me to quiet places, used bookstores where he'd geek out over Civil War memoirs, or this farmer's market where he'd buy me a jar of local honey just because I'd lingered by the stall. 8 months in, he asked me to move into his house, a fixer-upper he'd bought in a sleepy Austin suburb, complete with creaky floors, a wraparound porch, and this big oak tree in the front yard. My sister, Claire, practically shoved me into it, saying, "Ratch, he's a keeper, don't screw this up." My mom, who'd once called Dylan a walking red flag, met Mark over Thanksgiving and whispered, "Finally, a good one." I said yes, packed my stuff, and moved in, thinking I'd hit the jackpot. That first year was straight out of a dream. Mark was the king of little things. He'd leave sticky notes on my coffee mug in the morning, scribbled with stuff like, "You're my favorite person," or "Have a great day, babe." He'd come home from school with stacks of papers to grade, but if I'd had a rough day at the firm, he'd drop everything, order pad thai from the spot I loved, and rub my shoulders while I vented about depositions. We spend weekends fixing up the house, painting the kitchen this soft sage green I'd picked out, sanding the porch swing he'd found at a garage sale, planting basil and rosemary in the backyard even though I kept forgetting to water them. I'd swing a hammer like an idiot, missing nails half the time, and he'd laugh. "Good thing I'm here to save this place from you." I'd shove him, grinning, and think, yeah, good thing. At work, I got bumped up to senior paralegal, more money, more stress, and Mark would stay up late with me, quizzing me on case law or proofreading my emails to the partners, even when he had his own deadlines. My friends adored him. Claire's husband, Tom, called him the gold standard, and I felt it too. This was what grown-up love looked like, right? But then, maybe a year in, I started noticing things. Little things that gnawed at me. Mark was so careful. Every night he'd stand in the kitchen, chopping veggies for dinner, and ask, "What are you in the mood for?" instead of just deciding. I'd sigh, I don't care, pick something, and he'd list options: chicken, pasta, stir-fry, like a waiter reading a menu. At the grocery store, he'd spend 20 minutes comparing brands of olive oil, muttering about price per ounce, when I'd have just grabbed one and moved on. At parties, he'd hang back with the quiet crowd, Tom, the other teachers, sipping his beer, nodding along, while I'd drift to the loud ones, the guys swapping stories about bar fights or crazy exes. My last big ex, Dylan, was the opposite. He'd barge into any room, all swagger and noise, telling tales about crashing his van in New Orleans or punching some dude who'd grabbed his guitar. Dylan was a mess, cheated on me with my roommate, left me crying in a parking lot, but he had this fire, this edge that made my blood hum. Mark didn't. He was all soft corners, always checking, "You good, Ratch?" or "Need anything?" And after a while, that gentleness started feeling suffocating. I didn't say it out loud at first. I'd just huff when he'd suggest another cozy night in with Netflix instead of hitting a bar downtown. I'd smirk when he'd ask, "What do you think?" about every tiny choice, what color for the bathroom, where to go for our anniversary, like he couldn't trust his own gut. "God, Mark, just decide for once," I'd mutter, half laughing, half annoyed. He'd smile, "I just want us both to love it," and I'd think Dylan wouldn't ask, he'd just do it. One night at Tom and Claire's cookout, some loudmouth cut Mark off mid-story, something about a student's project, and Mark just let it happen, chuckling politely while the guy steamrolled him. I leaned over, beer in hand, and whispered, "You're gonna let him talk over you like that?" He shrugged, "Not a big deal, Ratch." I laughed too sharp and said, "You're such a pushover sometimes." The table snickered, Mark's ears turned red, but he didn't snap back, just sipped his drink and changed the subject. That's when it clicked. I didn't just want him to be sweet. I wanted him to fight, to growl, to be someone else. That cookout flipped a switch in me. Mark was perfect. Claire said it, my mom said it, even I'd said it once. But perfect started tasting bland. I'd lie in bed, Mark snoring softly beside me, his arm draped over my waist like a security blanket, and I'd stare at the ceiling, remembering Dylan. How he'd kick down my door at midnight, high on adrenaline from a gig, how we'd scream at each other over nothing and then crash into each other like a car wreck. It was toxic as hell. I'd caught him with my roommate, spent nights sobbing over his lies. But it was alive, electric, like every moment could explode. Mark's world was all muted tones, sage green walls, herbal tea, Sunday mornings with NPR, and I started craving something louder, messier, something to jolt me awake. I didn't want to lose him. I loved him, I swear, but I wanted him to feel different, to burn instead of glow. So I started pushing. It was subtle at first, little jabs to test him. We'd be in the kitchen, him stirring some pasta sauce he'd spent an hour perfecting, and I'd groan, "Why do you always ask what I want? Just make something, Mark." He'd pause, wooden spoon hovering, and say, "I just want you to enjoy it," his voice soft, patient. I'd roll my eyes. Dylan would have thrown whatever in a pan and called it dinner. "Guts, you know." He'd blink, "Why do you keep mentioning him?" And I'd shrug, because he didn't overthink everything. Mark wouldn't bite, just nodded, kept stirring, but I saw his shoulders stiffen. Good, maybe he'd snap, show some spine. At the hardware store, picking out paint for the guest room, he'd hold up swatches, beige, taupe, some muted blue, and ask, "Which one?" I'd snap, "Jesus, Mark, pick one. It's not a UN summit." He'd laugh, "You're feisty today," and I'd mutter, "Maybe if you weren't so damn tame, I wouldn't have to be." He'd go quiet, pick the blue, and we'd move on, but I'd stew, wishing he'd push back. It spilled over outside the house, too. At dinners with friends, I'd toss out barbs. "Mark's too nice to argue, so I'll say it." Or he'd rather grade essays than dance, and people would chuckle, thinking it was our shtick. But I'd watch his jaw clench, his smile tighten, and feel this weird thrill, like I was chipping away at that perfect shell. One night, we were at a bar with Claire and Tom, some dive with sticky floors and a jukebox blaring Johnny Cash. Mark was sipping a beer, chatting with Tom about some school fundraiser when this drunk guy bumped him, spilling half his drink. Mark just laughed, "No worries, man," and grabbed a napkin. I leaned in, voice sharp, "You're just gonna let him off. Dylan would have decked him." Mark turned, eyes narrowing for once. "I'm not Dylan, Ratch, sorry to disappoint." I smirked, "Yeah, no kidding," and he didn't reply, just finished his beer in silence. Claire caught me later, wiping down her kitchen counter after we got back to her place. "You're being harsh, Ratch. He's gold, don't break him." I waved her off. "He's fine, he needs to grow a pair. I'm helping him." She shook her head. "That's not how it works. but I brushed it past me. I thought if I kept poking, he'd rise up, become the guy I'd dreamed of, bold, fierce, a little rough. About 6 months into this, Dylan slid back into my orbit. He'd been gone since our breakup 4 years ago, moved to Houston, chasing his band's big break, last I'd heard. But he popped up on Instagram one day, DMing me. "Hey, Ratch in Austin for a gig, saw your art online, still killing it. Drink soon?" My pulse jumped. Dylan, tall, lean, all tattoos and trouble, was everything Mark was. I stared at his message, thumb hovering, picturing his smirk, that gravelly voice that used to unravel me. I didn't tell Mark, just replied, "Maybe when you free?" A week later, I met him at this grungy bar off 6th Street, the kind with graffiti on the walls and peanut shells on the floor. He strolled in, black tee stretched over his frame, ripped jeans, that same cocky grin that hooked me in college. We drank cheap whiskey, him neat me with a splash of Coke, and he told me about touring, sleeping in a van, nearly getting arrested in Baton Rouge. "Missed you, Ratch, you were always my muse," he said, leaning close, his breath warm with liquor. I laughed, "You're full of it," but my cheeks burned. I didn't kiss him, didn't even brush his hand, but I went home wired, replaying his laugh instead of Mark's quiet hum. Mark clocked it. We were in the living room a few days later, him grading quizzes on the couch, me sketching at the coffee table when he said, "You've been off lately, what's going on?" I shrugged, doodling harder, just restless, I guess. He set his pen down, glasses catching the lamplight. "Work us," I snapped. "Maybe if you weren't so predictable, I wouldn't be restless." His face shifted, confusion, then something sharper. "Predictable?" he echoed. "Yeah, Mark, safe, boring, all that," I said, tossing my pencil down. "You're like a damn Hallmark movie." He stared, then stood, voice low. "Sorry I'm not exciting enough for you." He grabbed his papers, went to the kitchen, and I heard the fridge open, a beer cap pop. I didn't follow, just texted Dylan, "You around this week?" He shot back, "Always for you, babe." My stomach flipped, and I told myself it was nothing, just a friend, a distraction. Dylan became my secret fix. We'd meet up, lunch at some food truck, drinks at a dive bar, always just catching up, but the air buzzed every time. He'd lean back in his chair, boots kicked up, and tease me about my little housewife life. "What you baking cookies now, Ratch? Where's the girl who'd shotgun beers with me?" I'd laugh. "She's still here, just on a leash," and he'd grin, "Cut it loose, then run with me." It was a game, I told myself, but it felt realer every time. Mark, meanwhile, was fading into the background, still there, still Mark, but quieter, like he was pulling away without leaving. He'd ask, "Heading out again?" When I'd grab my keys and I'd say, "Yeah, meeting friends," keeping Dylan's name out of it. He'd nod, "Have fun," but his eyes lingered, searching, and I'd bolt before he could dig deeper. One Saturday, I dragged Mark to a bar where Dylan's band was playing, a loud, sweaty joint with neon signs and a sticky stage. "Let's mix it up," I said, tugging him along, hoping he'd loosen up, match the energy. He went, reluctant in his usual button-up and jeans, while I wore this tight black top and boots, feeling alive already. Dylan spotted us mid-set, pointed at me from the stage, and rasped into the mic, "This one's for an old friend." He ripped into some punk cover we'd loved, and I cheered, leaving Mark at the bar to weave closer. After, I found Dylan by the merch table, sweaty and grinning. "Your man looks thrilled to be here," he said, nodding at Mark, who was perched on a stool, nursing a beer, stiff as a statue. "He's fine," I lied, but when I slid back to Mark, he said, "That your ex?" His voice was flat, eyes on his glass. I nodded casual, "Yeah, Dylan, old news." He swirled his beer, thought so, and didn't say another word. In the car, he asked, "Why's he back, Ratch?" I shrugged. "He's just around, relax, okay?" He stared out the windshield, then cranked the radio, drowning me out. The tension thickened. I'd come home late from drinks, hair mussed, reeking of bar smoke and Dylan's cigarettes, and Mark would be on the couch, grading papers or watching some documentary, silent as a ghost. I'd try to spark something. "Why don't you ever get pissed? Dylan would have lost it if I rolled in like this." He'd sigh, rubbing his temples, "I'm not Dylan, Rachel, I don't blow up over nothing." I'd yell, "Maybe you should, maybe I need that." He started crashing in the guest room, leaving our bed cold, and I'd text Dylan, "Mark's a shadow, rescue me." He'd reply, "Dump him, I'll show you real life." And I'd grin, heart racing, telling myself it was just talk. It all boiled over at Claire's 4th of July barbecue. A big backyard thing, string lights, kids running around, the smell of charcoal thick in the air. Mark was flipping burgers, chatting with Tom about some school grant, when Dylan showed up uninvited because I'd casually mentioned it over beers. He rolled in, leather jacket slung over his shoulder, boots kicking up dust, and I lit up, dragging him to the cooler. "Didn't expect you," I said, handing him a Lone Star. "Couldn't miss you in action," he winked, and I laughed, loud and free. Mark watched from the grill, spatula frozen, as Dylan slung an arm around me, cracking jokes about suburban hell. Claire hissed, "What the hell, Ratch? Why's he here?" I brushed it off. "He's fun, chill out." Later, by the fire pit, Dylan pulled me aside, away from the crowd, the flames casting shadows on his face. "You don't fit here," he said, voice low. "All this picket fence crap, it's not you." I laughed, maybe not, and he kissed me quick, hard, tasting of beer and smoke. I froze, pulled back, heart hammering, but Mark saw. He dropped the spatula, walked over, face pale, and said, "We're done." His voice was steady, final, cutting through the crackle of the fire. I stammered, "Mark, it's not," but he held up a hand. "Don't lie, I've seen enough." He turned, walked to the car, and drove off, leaving me standing there, Dylan smirking beside me. Mark moved out the next morning, packed a duffel bag with clothes, his laptop, a stack of books, and said he'd crash at Tom's. I was furious, packing the living room, still in my pajamas from the night before. "You're overreacting, it was one stupid kiss," I yelled, voice cracking. He zipped his bag, glasses fogging slightly, and looked at me, eyes tired. "Overreacting? You kissed him, Rachel, at my sister's house, with everyone watching. After months of him hanging around, you picking fights, comparing me to him, it's not one kiss, it's everything." I threw my hands up. "It was a mistake, I don't even want him." He shook his head, slow, deliberate. "You don't want me either. You want chaos, drama, some guy who'll break you again. I can't be that, I won't." I screamed, "You're giving up on us over this." He grabbed his keys, voice low. "You gave up on us a long time ago." The door shut behind him, soft but final, and I stood there, shaking, the house too quiet without his steady presence. Dylan swooped in like a vulture. That afternoon, he texted, "Heard your boy Bilaid drinks tonight?" I said yes, desperate to fill the void, and we hit a bar, dark, loud, the kind of place Mark hated. We drank too much, laughed too loud, and when he kissed me again, sloppy, urgent, pressed against the jukebox, I let it happen. A week later, he crashed at my place, boots kicked off by the door, and we hooked up, raw, messy, like stepping back into a time machine. I thought, this is it, this is what I've been missing. He'd sprawl on my couch, strumming his guitar, promising, "We'll run this town, Ratch, just you and me." For a minute, I believed him, drowning in that old fire, telling myself I'd traded up. But Dylan wasn't a trade-up, he was a relapse. 2 weeks in, he started flacking canceled dinner for a last-minute gig, showed up at 2 a.m. reeking of bourbon, too drunk to talk. I'd yell, "Where were you?" And he'd laugh, "Chill, babe, this is us." At a bar one night, I caught him flirting with some girl in a crop top, hand on her waist, that same smirk he'd used on me, and when I confronted him, he shrugged, "Not your keeper, Ratch, lighten up." I threw a drink in his face, stormed out, and he didn't chase me, just texted later, "You're hot when you're mad." 3 months in, I found texts from a chick named Lexi, "Miss you, sexy, come over," and he didn't even deny it. "We're not exclusive," he said, sprawled on my bed, lighting a cigarette. "Thought you knew that." My chest caved. I'd torched my marriage for this, for a guy who'd never change, just polished his act enough to fool me again. Mark filed for divorce a month later. I met him at a coffee shop to sign Neutral Ground, the air thick with roasted beans and regret. He looked worn, bags under his eyes, hair messier than usual, but composed, sipping black coffee while I fidgeted with my latte. "Mark, I messed up," I said, voice breaking. "I didn't mean for this, let's fix it." He set his mug down, glasses catching the light, and stared at me unflinching. "Fix it? You kissed him, Rachel. You've been chasing him for months. Every fight, every time you threw Dylan in my face, you chose him. I'm not your fallback plan." I begged, tears spilling. "I was stupid. I don't want him, I want you." He leaned forward, voice steady but sharp. "You don't know what you want. You had me everything and you tore it apart because I wasn't loud enough, rough enough, broken enough. I'm done." He signed the papers, slid them across, and walked out, leaving me staring at his empty chair, the ink still wet. Dylan bilayed a week after that, left a voicemail while I was at work. "Tours calling, Ratch, big break in Houston. You're a blast, but I'm not built for this domestic shit. Catch you later." I played it 3 times, his voice tinny through my phone, and laughed bitter hollow because of course he'd run. I'd traded gold for glitter, and the glitter blew away in the wind. The house went quiet. No more Mark humming in the kitchen, no more Dylan strumming on the couch. Just me, the creak of the floors, and a mortgage I couldn't swing alone. I moved out a month later, sold the Craftsman to some young couple who gushed about the porch swing, packed my life into a U-Haul, and landed in this shitty studio downtown. It's all I can afford now: peeling paint, a mattress on the floor, a view of a dumpster instead of that big oak tree. I scroll Mark's Instagram late at night. He's got a new job, assistant principal now, and a new girlfriend, some quiet brunette who looks like she'd never dream of kissing an ex by a fire pit. They're hiking in one photo, her smiling soft while he holds her hand, and it guts me. He's thriving, rebuilding, while I'm stuck here, picking up freelance gigs to cover rent, drinking wine that tastes like regret. Claire doesn't sugarcoat it. We met for coffee last week, her with her toddler in a stroller, me with dark circles under my eyes. "You had a diamond, Ratch," she said, stirring her latte, "and you chased a rock. Mark was perfect, why'd you do it?" I stared at the table, tracing scratches in the wood. "He was too perfect," I mumbled, "too safe. I wanted more." She snorted, "More what? Drama? Heartbreak? You got it." She's right, I did. My friends faded. Tom won't meet my eyes. The old crew stopped texting. Even Mom, over the phone, said, "You broke his heart, Rachel. I hope it was worth it." It was. Nights are the worst. I lie on my lumpy mattress, the faucet dripping, and replay it all. Every fight I picked, every time I shoved Dylan in Mark's face, that kiss by the fire. I wanted Mark's stability with Dylan's fire, thought I could force one into the other or trade up for something wilder. I lost both. Mark's gone, Dylan's a ghost, and I'm left with nothing but echoes of a life I torched chasing a storm that never came.